Hi everyone, welcome to another DSLayered episode of the Visible Layer. Joshua Fletcher here, and we're continuing our BW and Bob J podcast series. So again, I'm joined by Ethan Jewett. Ethan, how are you this morning?
All right, how are you this evening?
Good. Opposite sides of the world. So just to recap our last episode, we spoke a lot about the past 6 to 9 months, what's happened in the SAP business intelligence community. There's been a lot of discussion about BW and business objects, and so what we wanted to do was to start this podcast series, which would look in technical detail about why a non-SAP customer that may have business objects would look at a solution like BW for their enterprise data warehouse.
Yep. So I think the plan for today is mostly to just look at the basic integration of how you get data into BW from a BobJ environment, so data services, and what options are available there, and then building what is going to amount to a data mart, a very kind of quick and dirty, frankly not that well thought out, because we're just kind of doing it on the fly data mart in BW, and then we'll talk a little bit about where we go from there, and either this time or next time, next podcast, how this sort of starts to transition a little bit into more of a data warehouse, or as you build in more data marts and bring in more data. So, looking forward to it.
Yeah, excellent. So just to remind everyone, the systems we're using an Amazon web service backend for this on EC2, and it's a Windows Server 2008 R2. We're running BW 7.03, I think, Ethan, is that right?
Well, I'm assured by various people. So if you look at the version number on BW, it's actually 7.3 Enhancement Pack 1, which is the NetWeaver 7.3 Enhancement Pack 1 version. But that's sometimes advertised, it seems like, as NetWeaver 7 Enhancement Pack 3. So it's all very confused. I'm talking to the demo people. I'm talking to the demo people to try to get it straightened out. But if you look at the version in the system, it seems to be 7.3.
Okay, so we're using BW 7.3, and we're also using BusinessObjects BR4 Service Pack 4 with Data Services BR4 Service Pack, I think it's 4 or 2 as well. So we've got the complete BusinessObjects environment as well as BW stood up, and that's what we're using. So I guess we can jump straight into a screen share, Ethan, and start to look at how we've connected BW to Data Services.
Yep, I will. I'll start sharing, and we can start talking about what we've done.
There's me lots of times.
All right, yeah, it's like the recursive screen share. So I will get that out of the way and switch over to our Amazon Web Services system. And let me just bring this full screen so that it's a little bit easier to see. All right. How does that look to you, Josh?
Yep, that looks fine.
Seems to be working? All right, great. So this is our BW system, and just as proof of what we were talking about last time, or just before here, it appears to be released BW 7.3 Enhancement Pack 1, SP4, so who knows what that means. On SCN, the installable demo that we looked at last time is what we're using, and that says 7.0 Enhancement Pack 3. So it's just as bad in the NetWeaver space as it is in the business object space as far as version numbers. So to see what we've done, I think to start out, we want to talk about the connectivity of data services. And I wanted to just take a second before we start, if people want to do this on their own, to show for this demo system, this trial system, what you actually have to do to make BW work. So we're going to be using a bunch of transaction codes here, and they don't work if you don't do this first. So let me just, if it's okay with you, Josh, I'll just walk through this really quickly.
Yeah, for sure. Yep.
So after you get your BW system installed from the trial version, you need to go to transaction SPRO, as you can see in the upper left-hand corner, which is the customizing workbench more or less, and then click on reference ing. And the idea here is we're just going to make one really important setting for BW. We need to go to links to other source systems, so SAP NetWeaver Business Warehouse, links to other source systems, and then general connection settings. And the reason we have to do this is because BW, when it first starts, actually uses itself as a source system. And so if it hasn't been set up properly to link to other source systems, then it's just not going to work. And all we need to do is define a logical system. And what you want to do for that is ignore the warning. And you just click on create a new entry up here, and you create this entry that we see here. NSP CLNT 001, and you can give it whatever name you want. I call it NSP client 001. NSP is the name that the trial system always has. So every SAP system has a 3-letter name, kind of, or system ID, and that's NSP in this case. And then we have to assign that logical system to a client, and in order to do that, we go to the second option there, and then we choose client 001, which is the client we're in. You can see down in the lower right-hand corner, NSP client 001. We do the second button here, which is the details button. And then right here where it says logical system, you have to put this in, the logical system we just created, and then you click the save button, and then back out. It will prompt you for transports when you do this. If you're not sure what a transport is, you can look it up, but you just need to create a new one and give it any name you want. And that's it. After you do that, BW should work, except that it doesn't. The next step, because the system is not properly configured when it's installed, is to go to the transaction SECSTORE, SECSTORE. Just click the little clock checkmark execute button in the upper left-hand corner. And then there will be some options here that are red. And you need to select those things that are red, which will be these two, most likely, the HMAC ones, and you just delete them. Push the delete button, and that's all you need to do. Then you back out. And then you can go to the RSA1, the BW workbench, and it will work, theoretically. So once we went through all that, we wanted to set up a data services source system. And in BW 7.3, that's actually really easy. In 7.0 and 7.01, 7.02, it's more involved. There are good how-to guides on SCN about how to do that for the older systems. It's just not quite as simple. But for us, it's actually really easy because we're on NetWeaver 7.3. So all we actually have to do is first we have to do one step in BusinessObjects, and in order to do that we have to go to the Management Console. Log in. And I'm really grateful for Josh for teaching me how to do this. And go to SAP Connections and the RFC server interface. And we needed to create this server interface. So we've already done this, but the important thing is the settings. Right, I'm in the wrong tab. I need to go to server interface configuration, and the settings are going to be more complicated for you if you have a real install somewhere, but for us it's just we're just going to use our existing BW user, BC user, and that password, which is a password you set when you do the installation and follow the installation instructions. It's on the same server, so it's localhost. It's client number 001, like we saw before, system number 00. And the gateway stuff just comes with the system. So you need to basically set up what you see here for it to work. And then when you first start it, it may or may not work. If it doesn't, look at the error messages. Probably you've put like the system name where you should have localhost or something like that. But it should show up as a green check mark and started. And this is the RFC server interface that allows BW to talk to data services and data services to talk to BW. So it's pretty important. Once you do that, you can actually go back to BW, go to the Source Systems tab in RSA1, go to the BO Data Services folder to create. You give it a logical system name like test. You give it a source system name, which can be anything you want. Type and release, which is, I think, anything you want. Yeah. Which is test. And apparently that's not allowed. This happens a lot in BW. It gets very finicky. And then the only thing we have to put in here is the program ID, which we have to get from data services. And it's the RFC program ID that we set up originally, which in our case is BW client NFC, NSP. And you want to just do a connection test, make sure it works. It says that the test was okay. So if the test isn't okay, then something bad happened. Like you forgot probably to do the sexstore fix that we had at the beginning. That actually, those red dots there make those HMAC problems make the RFC connections not work. Or the RFC server on business objects is not started. So yeah, it was prompting me there. Sorry, I just bypassed that. But when you create the actual system, you have to give it access to the business objects metadata repository. So you have to give it your business objects username and password, administrator username and password, or another user you've set up for BW to use. And the reason for that we'll see later is that when you create data sources in BW for use with business objects, data services, it actually creates objects in data services that you can see, that show up and that you can see. So I mean, yeah, let's get into it a little bit. As far as we've got the basic connection working, we can create data sources to connect to data services. I've already done some pre-work here. I logged in and spent an hour or so setting up this stuff because I mean, truthfully, working in BW is a little bit it can be a little bit mind-numbing sometimes, just because it can be very manual. So there's not that much mass maintenance. There are not that many mass maintenance options, and so you have to manually do a lot of clicking sometimes. So it tends to be a good idea to think a little bit about what you want to do first, be comfortable with playing around. It does take time to set up data structures and that sort of thing, and we'll demonstrate what needs to happen to do that. The nice thing is, I mean, sometimes I guess it's fair to say about BW that it can make really hard things pretty easy. Things like nearline storage or like full system moves from one database to one type of database to another type of database. But it can make easy things pretty annoying. And so, yeah, it's just kind of what you have to deal with. And really, I mean, SAP could do a lot of work on making BW more user-friendly for administrators. But it hasn't been a high priority, I guess. So this is, I mean, be warned. It's not as Business Objects has its rough edges too, but I don't think that they approach the roughness of some of BW's edges.
So Ethan, we've connected the BW to data services. So
yep.
What are I guess what's the workflow that we're going to go through in this episode in terms of actually getting the data into BW and then using that data?
Right. So what we want to do is Josh has set up several tables in data services based on the sales demo database that we've got, sample sales STS, that we are going to want to pull into BW and generate a data model. So
yeah,
we're pretty much going to generate a data model.
Yeah, great. So just for the business objects audience, I have an existing SQL Server database that is courtesy of Business Objects. It's a sample sales database, and I created a data store in Data Services, and then I imported the tables that were relevant to our data mart. So they've been imported, and the Data Services repository has all the metadata information about those tables, and from there we can then leverage them in BW.
Right. Yeah, you can't see me nodding, but I'm nodding along. So Josh has done this work in the data services side, which is good because I would have had trouble doing it. And now we've got these tables available in data services. So I mean, we've got Josh put together a little. I'm in the wrong window. No, I don't want the Google Hangout. Sorry. Josh put together a diagram of what the tables look like, how they connect together. So this is it. And the focus is going to be on orders, or specifically order details is going to be the central kind of fact table for this production here. And we've got, as part of that, we've got an order ID, customer, employee ID, and then information about where those places are, where those people are, cities, countries, regions, products, product categories, and lines. So it's
sorry, Ethan. Just to set the scene for the rest of the podcast series, we want to take the employee data, which is salespeople selling orders to customers, and we then want to match that up to a disparate data source which has a list of all of our employees and their compensation. And so it's a completely different data source. We're going to need to do some data matching of those. We don't have the same primary keys for those employees, and we want to then, that's going to be the start of our enterprise data warehouse.
Exactly. Yep. So I mean, despite the fact that it's kind of thrown together, we'll start to see a little bit of the path towards a really kind of aligned, centralized approach to data harmonization. It's a long path, but we'll see the beginning of it. So cool. And yep. So let's dive in. We've got these tables in the data services repository. I've already connected to most of them with BW and loaded them, but I left off a couple. Specifically, order details is missing from this list of data sources that I've already created, and something else: employees, regions, orders themselves. The order IDs is missing. So we'll create those two data sources quickly, and then move along. So to create a data source in BW, pretty straightforward. You just give it a name. Traditionally, you start names of customer objects in BW with a Z, so we're going to call it Z orders. That's actually not really necessary in our case, but we'll do it in any case because I'm conservative, old-fashioned. So we just give it a short description, and then the important thing for data services, for connecting to data services, is here under the extraction table. We have to choose the source object, which is that table in the repository. Now, one of the many rough edges here is that we're going to choose the orders table, DBO orders, but you might notice that here these are all lowercase and actually correspond not to what's in the repository, but to what's in the actual database here. And so most of these tables actually aren't in, I hope I'm using the right terminology, Josh, in the data services repository. Only the ones that...
The metadata about them, yeah. Yep.
Yeah, only the ones that are in this list of tables are actually in the repository. And you'll notice also that the case is different. So over in the actual database, we have kind of a camel case approach, although it's not that consistent. And then in the repository, it's all uppercase. So For those of us who worked with BW for a long time, we know that this is probably going to cause a problem because BW is very finicky about these sorts of things. And in fact, it actually offers us a proposal of fields, and that can be transferred to the field table. But when we do the check up here, it's going to tell us that there's something very wrong. The source object does not exist in the repository. So here BW is a little bit confused because it thinks that it can take data directly from the source database, but it can't. It needs to be in the business objects repository first. So we will manually put in the name of the table in the metadata repository, and we will get the proposal again and check it again. And now everything's fine. So we'll save and we'll activate. This is what you pretty much always do in BW. It's check, save, activate, although you can just go straight to activation and it will save it and check it as part of that process. All right, so we've got orders now. And then we'll notice that all these other ones have what's called an info package. So there's this thing here, which is actually what the load process is. I'm just going to quickly create the order details data source, and then we will...
So at this stage, we haven't actually loaded any data into BW. We've only imported the metadata around those tables that we're going to use.
Exactly. So in this case, yeah, for the other tables that are already there, I've already loaded them, so we don't have to do that. But in this case, we've imported metadata. As part of importing that metadata, you have to define whether it's going to be master data, attributes, text, or transactional data, and we'll get back to that a little bit. But as far as data services, data sources, this actually doesn't really matter. But because we're going to be using the order details as transactional data, I will set it up that way. Any questions?
So the other thing to note, the other thing to note just while you're doing that, Ethan, is we've taken a simple approach where we're actually letting BW call data services jobs and load the data in, but BW does all the administration and management of that. There's also a second option we can use where we could actually build a job in data services and use BW as a target data store.
Exactly.
We can load the data in directly without it actually coming through this screen. Is that?
Let me create the info sources or info packages, and then I will actually show what the difference is. Because it's actually kind of interesting. So we can just quickly look at that. So an info package gets created like this. You just right-click, create info package on top of the data source. It creates it. You can save it, and then to run it, you actually just go to the Schedule tab and then click Start, and it will populate what's called the PSA, the persistent staging area of the data source, with data from the source system. So getting data into BW from data services is not too hard. It's kind of annoying because you have to do all this clicking around, as you can see, which is why I did the other 8 first. But it's pretty straightforward. And then if we look at the PSA here, we'll see the actual data is coming in, and then we'll hop over to the data services side and see what's going on there.
So from an ongoing perspective, is that info package that you just loaded the data in, you would then schedule that to run on a regular basis, or
Exactly.
you have to do some work around delta loading and stuff like that?
Well, yeah, we could do work around delta loading. So these are the orders, the order IDs. So there's not really it's kind of a little bit difficult to explain how the delta solution works. So usually in data services, when you want to create a delta, you do something where you kind of create a variable based on date or something like that, or some delta field in the source table, and then it stores what the last sort of delta that you loaded was. And then you can have your data services job do a filter selection or where selection on the table, on the source table, and only get what's new, more or less.
Yeah. There's also an option. So that's one option. That's what we'd call source-based CDC. So where the source system or source data is telling you what the deltas are, whether that's database-based change data capture, or like you just said, like a timestamp or a delta flag. The alternative is to use target-based CDC, where there doesn't exist that information in the source system. So what we would then do is pick up the entire data set and then compare it to the target, work out what has changed, what needs to be updated, what needs to be deleted, what needs to be inserted, and then apply those changes to the target. So you've got either option in data services.
Exactly. And so the first is much more efficient, I guess you would say, and the second is like data services has to load the whole thing in and figure out what the delta is. And so BW has pretty much the same options. For native source databases for BW, it actually supports as of 7.3, it supports a delta functionality that is very much like the data services source-based delta. But then the DSO construct, which we will see later on, also has the ability to calculate a delta. So very much like the internal data services capability of calculating deltas. The DSO, the nice thing about the DSO is that it actually creates a change log, so it keeps the information about the change that has happened for every delta record that overwrites a new record. So that's a kind of cool bit of functionality that allows it to actually do, in addition to delta calculation, or in addition to, well, it allows it to calculate a change delta, more or less, instead of an overwrite delta.
Sorry, just to to interject for a second. So we talked about info packages, which are the means that we load the data into BW. You mentioned the PSA, which is a persistent staging area, and which is basically like just a copy of the raw data.
Yep.
Is that right? And then the DSO, what does that stand for again?
Data store object.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we'll go into a bit more detail about what that is. Yeah.
Exactly. Yep. We'll talk about DSOs a little bit later.
I'll pick you up on all the BW terminologies. So we can explain.
Let's see how these things are linked. First of all, so you'll notice that the info package in BW we talked about is the thing that loads data into BW from data services. So there's got to be some. So this info package has a companion object on the data services side. So if we look at the technical name here. The important part being, well, ZPack is always info package, and then DE1WX is the same for most of them, but LR2G7. Let's remember that. Heck, LR2G7. So we'll go over to the data services side, and we want to find our jobs, and we'll find actually that they don't properly refresh. Oh, they don't properly refresh. So we were going to get out of data services, unless you know of a way to refresh this, Josh.
No, it's directly calling it from the database. So
we're going to close it, and we're going to reopen it, and we'll see a job for this info package. Pay no attention to the license message.
I was wondering about that. We've just scraped in. We've got 2 days left, so I have to reset it. Next few days.
You're going to have to update it for next week.
Yep.
All right, so we'll hop back in, and we will take a look at our batch jobs this time. And we'll see our new batch jobs down here. And this should load order details if we remember correctly. So got that here. Double click in, and indeed it's loading the order details transactional data source table. So this schema out is actually, we could actually find that in a SAP BW target system, type target system within data services as well. But this just basically automates the process, and it's mostly managed from the BW side. Now, an interesting question is, could we change this? And the answer, I think, is yes. We can change the transformation. We're not allowed to change the schema out or the schema in, I don't believe, but we could do something to the data in between the in and the out and change the format or something like that. And I think that might be useful, especially in terms of things like dates, date conversions, and that sort of thing. If you want to actually do something more like what Josh was talking about earlier, where you have full control over the schema out and you're really doing all your data transformation and data services, then I think the best probably idea would be not to use a data services type source system, but to create a different type source system, just called of the external system type. But you could actually do, well, frankly, you could do either. But you could create one of the external systems type, and then for every data source you create there, it will actually show up in data services, and you can directly populate data in the PSA. The other option would be to actually just go into each of these data sources, and if you wanted to change something like one of the fields, you can manually actually go in, and we got a proposal from the source database, but we are allowed to go in and manually change this list of fields. Now we have to actually go into change mode. Actually, I guess we're not allowed to change everything here. I'm not actually that familiar with data services, data sources. But
yeah, I mean, if we did create that kind of external data source, so we had like a table already set up that we defined, and we defined all the fields manually, then you would then be able to build the job on the data services side, pick that up in your BW target, and then apply whatever transformations you want, and you can do a lot of work probably on the data services side before the data actually hits and it's all cleaned and validated and transformed in the way you want. And
yep, exactly. So here we're actually pretty constrained by BW as far as what we're allowed to change here, but normally in a data source in an external data source in BW, we're allowed to change things. So I think actually the problem is most likely that there's data in the PSA here. So let's just actually do a quick experiment and delete the orders, and then see if we can actually change the structure of the data source. No guarantees that this actually works. This is what happens when you do things on the fly, but nah, we're not going to be allowed to, I think. Yeah, well, so when you're working in a data services source system, it seems like you're fairly constrained, and you have to have.
I guess that makes sense because you're basically just taking the fields from data services is the master definition of the table and the fields. So
exactly, it's like it's as if data services is just an external database, and so the idea of a PSA and data source is to replicate an external database into BW. And if you want to really use data services as your ETL tool, then you would create an external system and as a data source associated with data services, and then load in using data services itself. So there's definitely some work to do there on the integration side, but should be able to satisfy most requirements, I think. So our orders are done loading. And we should have a lot of them, I would imagine, if it took that long. Yep, seems like it. And we can move on to the next step, I think. Are we ready for that, or was there something else to clarify here?
No, I'm good. Let's go.
All right, cool. So after we've got the data into the PSA, we need to get it somewhere permanent. So in BW, a PSA, a persistent staging area, is actually not very persistent. Usually we want to only keep, maybe a couple of weeks worth of data in there. Preferably we're using a delta approach, so we would modify those jobs or transformations on the data services side to do a source-based delta or something like that, so that we don't have that much data in the PSA. But even if we're doing that, things are going to get out of hand pretty quickly if we're like loading FI data or order data or customer interaction data or something like that. So these PSAs get cleared out fairly regularly. So we need to put it into something permanent. And the permanent structures we use in BW to store data are either info providers or info objects. Info providers up here are structures used for reporting primarily. So they're like info cubes, data store objects, which we talked about earlier, and we'll talk again in a minute. And info objects are master data primarily, dimensional objects that are used to build info providers. So usually we start with the info objects, and I've already created a bunch that you can see in this. I've created most of what we can see here in this diagram. So, but it's a very flat approach. And then individual info objects will have attributes, which are the attributes of the dimensional object. So just like we see in the employees table here, we have last name, first name, birth date, hire date, address. We've got last name, first name, address. I left out some things, and we can talk about what to do about those, but for the most part, they're all here. And then this is where we're going to end up storing the employee data that comes in. And we'll get to that in a second. And then,
so the interesting thing there is that that's just a flat view of all the fields that are master data attributes. Is there any kind of, in terms of grouping of this is employee master data and this is customer master data and this is product master data? How do you see that?
Well, there's not really a grouping at the moment. You can use these anywhere, which is, so for example, there's one address, but it's used in both customers and employee. So it's an attribute of both employee and customer. So if we look at the attributes, we have an address. It's that address, which we can see up here, is that address. And then under customer, we'll have the same thing. The other thing, this is a little bit more of a semantic modeling. So this is address here. This is a little bit more of a semantic modeling approach than is traditional in SQL databases. So we do things like use BW functionality around employee, and you'll note that here there's one field of employee called reports to, which is a fairly common HR structure where you have a manager that's also an employee. So this is actually going to be a number, an ID number, which is also in the employees table is the idea. And so we would actually use a structure where we create a reports to object, which I'm calling Z manager. But it's actually just employee. It has what's called a reference. It's a reference characteristic. It's called in BW, and we don't load data into this separately. It's just employee data. So it has employee more or less has a circular reference, and your reports to actually has their own reports to their own manager here, because they're actually just another employee. Is that
hierarchical, or is it basically just a kind of parent-child?
This is not hierarchical. This is this is an attribute relationship, I guess I would call it in BW. So it's a hierarchical relationship, but it's not defined as a hierarchy in terms of BW hierarchies. We could generate a hierarchy based on this. So in employee, we could add a hierarchy to it by checking off the box for employee with hierarchies. And then there are a bunch of options around the type of hierarchies you're going to have. You can make them time dependent in various ways. You can put external characters and characteristics into them, like report to, for example. And you can maintain them manually, or you can load them. And I think we'll look at that actually for the city, country, region data model that's over here on the left side, because this is something that is probably better off as a BW hierarchy than as an attribute modeled type of thing. But yeah, so we're not going to build a hierarchy, but we can look at how that would happen if you wanted to build it manually at least. Is that clear, or is that unclear?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so this is kind of a mess, and usually what you do in BW when you build these things is you don't put them all into one. This is called this is called info object catalog. You would split them up by topic, but in this case, since it's all for the sales demo, then I'm putting it all in here. But once this becomes a data warehouse, you start to rearrange this type of stuff. You put all the employee master data together. You start using naming conventions. That kind of thing. So the other type of info object, there are two types of info objects in BW. There's characteristics and there are key figures. More or less, key figures are numbers, and so these are the key figures that I've already created. We need to create two more, and I've lost my data model again. I'm in the process of creating the order details table, or the info objects that will need to create the order details table, and we still need to create order level and quantity ordered. So we're going to do that really quickly. Any questions while we're doing this?
How much flexibility do you have in terms of doing calculations like, we've got ship date and required date, so the date difference as a measure, or also, account of the order header ID, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, once you get into the proper date format, you actually can do date arithmetic more or less. Probably the best place to do that is usually at the reporting level. So you would create kind of a calculated key figure that was order date minus ship date, or ship date minus order date, I guess would make more sense.
Okay, so these are like simple measures that we need to roll up like a
yeah, we would need to create those at the reporting at the BEX level. I mean, so I think we'll get into this probably next time, but in more detail. But BW has its own semantic layer, which are BEX queries, and you can do a lot of stuff like creating calculated key figures and calculated measures in that semantic layer, and then there's another semantic layer, right, which is the BI4 universe semantic layer, which can consume data directly from a info queue, or an info provider, but not from a query, not from a BEX query. So the two semantic layers don't really talk to each other. And that, I mean, in my opinion, that's actually unfortunate, because it would be nice to be able to leverage the semantic work that's already been done in BW, but layer on top of that the business layer that has been developed in BI4 and is being used for everything else. So it's kind of, I mean, it would be best if people could just speak one language, kind of, and interface through BI4 into BW, but use BW's measures if they've already been created. But currently that's not really possible. So, all right, order level. I'm just checking on the length I need for order level here.
And just another terminology thing. So what we would refer to as a measure, something that you would aggregate, is called a key figure. And a dimension, what we would call a dimension, something that you group, the context around the key figure is called a characteristic.
Yeah, a characteristic or an info object. Well, key figures and characteristics are both info objects, but in this case, yes. So it would be a characteristic. So this is our order level characteristic, and I just need to turn off the texts here because it's not necessary, since we're not going to be loading text data for this thing. If we did decide later on that we wanted text data, then we can, no problem, just check that box again, just like we can for hierarchies. And then I'll create a key figure for our quantity ordered. Quantity ordered, and here we're actually going to use a reference key figure for zero quantity, because it's actually usually what you want to do is for things like quantities and amounts, you want to reference the central ones, zero quantity and zero amount. Just the easiest thing to do. There are some situations in which you provide
formatting. Is that what it's for? A reference key figure? Is that just like a formatting, like a template?
It makes it so that everything uses the same sort of thing. There are situations in which you don't want to do this. So, especially if for some reason you're going to have two quantities in the same fact table, but they're going to use different units of measure. Then you would need to use two different quantity key figures, and in each one you would specify the unit of measure as a different info object or a different unit info object. So BW has a lot of intelligence around units of measure and currencies, and you want to make sure to be able to leverage that. So it's something
that we lack on the business object side with the semantic layer there.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this because we're going to see when we start loading data in what ways what we've done here is very quick and dirty, because like what's coming over from business objects oftentimes has the unit of measure attached to it in that field, and because that's the way it is in the sales database, in the sales demo database. So there will be like a $sign or pounds or cubic feet or something like that. as part of the actual string that comes across, and we're going to have to do a little bit of work stripping that out in order to do good reporting on it. And so, it's just something to keep in mind as a difference, and something we're definitely going to have to deal with. So let's hop over to the info provider view and look at what we've got here. So it's kind of interesting that info objects can also be info providers. So we can actually report if we specify in the info object master data text down here an info area, which is this here, the sales demo with data services. Then it makes it actually reportable, and it makes it so we can load data directly to it easily. And so I need to actually load data to the order info object because we haven't done that yet. In fact, I need to finish creating the order info object. I need to add those two things we just created. So right now we've got this list of attributes, but we need to add. No, we don't. Actually, that's going to be in the order details. What am I doing? All right, we don't need to add anything to this thing. Forget it. Ignore me. All right, so, but we do need to load it. So we've already created order.
So this is loading the data from the PSA to the DSO?
Right, so we need to create an object that connects the PSA to the info object. We're not loading to a DSO here, we're loading the master data. Okay. But yeah, we need to create an object that connects it to the DSO. And that's called a transformation in BW. It actually uses the same little icon pretty much as you have in data services. And we're going to be loading from a data source, specifically orders, from the DS sales source system. And it will come up with a little picture of our transformation, and we just have to drag stuff over and connect the proper fields in the source to the proper fields in the target. I'm not going to connect the dates, and we will find out why soon. All right. I didn't add all of the source fields to the order, but I added the ones that seemed relevant. And we're gonna have to do a little bit of work around the dates, but we'll get there. We'll put our process into place, and then if we have enough time in this podcast, we'll come back and do a little bit of work on the dates. But otherwise, I'll just do it offline, and we'll take a look at it next time around. Okay. So that's our transformation, and then transformations are the rules for moving data, and then the data transfer process is what actually moves the data. And we just activate, and it will yell at us because we're not using semantic groups for extraction, which allows it to be parallel. Right now this is going to run serial. Semantic groups just tell it that it can group things up separately in a particular way. So we would say, like, you can group by order ID or something like that. And it would then create packages that it could run in parallel. But if we don't tell it can do it parallel, then it won't do it parallel. So we got our 7,733 records loaded. So now we've got everything in place that we need to create our dimensional model, which in this case is going to be a DSO. So we will do that, if that's okay with you.
Let's do it.
All right. So still in the info provider view, we just right-click on an info area. That's what this is called. It's just an organizational folder, more or less. And we can create a bunch of different stuff. Among them are our data store objects. We could also create an info cube, another info area, a multi-provider, which we will actually create later. And all this cool stuff, virtual providers, hybrid providers. There's lots of objects that you can create in BW, and it's actually gotten a little out of control in the 7.3 version. With this stuff on the bottom, the hybrid provider, aggregation level, composite provider. They're going to try to cut down, actually, because really BW should be smart about the way it manages data. So you should be able to give it semantic information about how you want it to manage the data, and it should figure out itself how it's going to do that. Especially with the advent of HANA, info cubes and data store objects start to look really similar. So there's not really any point in having all these different types of objects anymore in some ways. So the team that's working on BW definitely has that in mind, and in the release notes for the latest version of BW, they've mentioned that they're gonna try to cut down. One interesting option we've got here is to semantically partition our object. This actually uses a wizard interface to where we create a kind of a template object, and it actually then makes potentially a bunch based on how we want it to split of data store objects, and loads them all in parallel and manages them all in parallel. So it's a nice new feature, 7.3, that can manage semantic partitioning pretty well. Again, it's not perfect, and BW is very finicky about the number of letters that I put in names of various objects. So I only get 8 letters for names of data store objects. So we need to come up with some creative naming approaches. So you're seeing this for the first time. I've never created a DSO on this system before, so it compiles a lot. We've got our DSO up here now, and DSOs have some characteristics. So a standard DSO is made up of 3 tables. It's an active table, a changelog table, and an activation queue. And when you load a DSO, data first goes into the activation queue, and then you activate the data, and it calculates, it looks at the active table, it compares the data in the activation queue to the active table, figures out what the differences are, updates the active table with the latest data, and it updates the changelog with the differences between what was in the active table and what's now in the active table. So this is a delta calculation feature. There are other types of DSOs. So in addition to the other types of info providers we talked about, there are direct update DSOs, which are basically flat tables. And then there are right optimized DSOs, which are flat tables as well, but have a little bit of semantics around them as far as keeping load packages separate. So they have a technical index or a technical key, and then a semantic key that you define. We want SID generation during activation. So SIDs in BW are actually the dimensional reporting objects. So you can do a DSO without SIDs if you're not going to do reporting on it. It makes activation faster. And then we can do something like forcing unique data records, which we're not going to do. But there are several options here. And then we actually just try to close that, and then we build our data structure. So going back to look at our order details, we need a little bit more, I think, than, let me see. Oh, no, I guess order ID is good enough as far as a key here. I think we need order level in the key as well. Is that correct, Josh?
I think it'd be a combination of, sorry, the screen's gone away now because I'm talking.
Oh, sorry. But I think looking at some of the data that comes in, well, let's take a look at it. So we'll go back to our data source, and if we know how to do this right, we should be able to sort of keep our new DSO open while we look at the data that's been loaded. So let's look at a little bit of sample data. So we've got we've got multiple order IDs that are the same, but then they have different product IDs on them. So these are like lines, basically, I would imagine. And then the order level is blank, so this is not part of our key.
So yeah, I think it'd be order ID and product ID.
Order ID and product ID. All right, sounds fair. Let's back out then. And then, so our key fields need to be the key. And in order to find what we're going to put in here, the easiest way to do it, you can actually search. You can go over here and do searches for things and find info object catalogs and bring those in. And we already know what we want in here basically, so we're just going to manually use direct input. We want order, we want product, and hit enter and it pops up if it finds them. Those are going to be our key fields. And then our data fields are going to be we can actually do search in here. So we might unit price, yeah. Z quantity. Z discount. Make sure all those come through. This is actually not Z, it's 0 because it's the built-in one. Net sales and Z order. Unit cost, cost, and quantity ordered. Cost and Z quantity. Can't remember how I spelled that, so we will search for it. That's not how I spelled it, apparently. There we go. All right. So everything's here. Just pop it in. Now, if we'd done something like if we actually use navigational attributes on these, like on order, we would actually be able to define navigational attributes. We haven't done that yet, so we might do that in the future if we have a reporting requirement.
And what's a navigation attribute?
And what navigational attributes are is they pretty much make the attributes of something like product available as dimensions of the data store object. So, which means that we can then navigate on the attributes of the attribute of product. So if product has an attribute like category, the perfect one, to go back to our diagram, if product has an attribute like category, then we could actually do filtering and displaying based on lines, which is an attribute of category. That only works one level deep, so you can't make a navigational attribute of a navigational attribute into a dimension in an object like a DSO. You can only do the attribute of the use the attributes of the navigational attribute. So we run into trouble then over here with things like region, because in our order details table, well, we would bring in customers into the order details table, but if customers in the table, then we can make city a navigational attribute of customer, and then we can do navigation based on country in that DSO. But we wouldn't be able to do navigation based on region. So we're going to need to have a little bit of a discussion around modeling that. But the approach is just to bring in city, country, and region into the table for the most part. So, all right, where are we? Need to back out. Remembering where you are in BW is a very important skill. You can also define special indexes. So there's going to be, by default, an index based on the key fields or on product, but if you want a different index for faster lookups, then you can make one. So that'll create a database index. On a HANA system, that's basically irrelevant because this is a columnar. DSOs are modeled as columnar tables in HANA systems. But on a normal database, it's modeled as a row-based relational table, and if you want to do a lookup on order level or something like that, you need to define an index, or it's going to be very slow. So the same goes for reporting if you want to filter on something or oh man. So now we get net sales. All right, it's unhappy with us. So welcome to the real world. All right, let's close this out. It says that zero amount needs to be included. God knows why. Oh, another thing to point out is that it pulled in automatically these two fields, zero currency and zero unit, which are required by our key figures. So cost requires a currency, zero currency here. And and our quantities require a 0 unit. So let's try pulling in 0 amount and seeing if it fixes the problem. And I'll just be a little red-faced about it requiring that. And all right, let's do a test. It thinks everything's okay. Let's try to activate it again. So what it seems to be saying is when something is a reference key figure, then it needs to have the actual key figure in there, which frankly is news to me. But what can you do? So normally what you would do is have 0 amount be like net sales or something like that. In this case, we're just going to have it be a throwaway key figure that's not going to be used. And again, I've never created a DSO in the system, so it has to compile like the entire ABAP BW system before I can create the DSO. But when we're done, we'll have a shiny new DSO that should work fine, and we can go to work trying to load it.
So we're getting close to the top of the hour. So
yep.
What can we? So should we load the DSO and then talk a little bit about what we're going to do in the next episode then?
Yeah. So we wanted to keep it. How much time have we used up so far, Josh?
I think we're going for about an hour, actually.
Really? But recording? Oh yeah, we have. All right.
Yeah.
Well, let's do this, and then let's load the DSO, and then we can push the Bex query to the next time. So between explaining and building, it always takes longer. Yeah, let's do that. I think that's a good plan. Shall we?
Yep.
All right. So let's just build the transformation quickly. Again, we've got order details already in a data source. And it'll build our transformation for us. And we'll just connect everything up. So it figured out that quantity should map to 0 quantity, but it's not smart enough to do anything else. Sorry, just being perplexed for a moment. So you'll note that a lot of stuff has disappeared. Where did it go? Good question. I've screwed this up actually. I wasn't supposed to create those all as reference info objects. Haha. All right, I'll fix this for next time. But in the meantime, we can just do this as a. That's actually shocking. I've worked on BW for like 7 years, and I probably learned this at the very beginning and then forgot. So
it's the pressure of recording a live
exactly.
podcast.
So all we do is just map our fields and then create our DTP. So DTPs that go into DSOs are by nature parallel. There are ways to make them serial, but generally they go parallel. And we just activate, and then we pray that it will actually work.
Cool. And so just to kind of set a scene for what's going to happen next. So we've got this data in the DSO.
Yep.
What are the next steps before we can basically create a Bex query?
We can do it. We should be able to do it now. So,
okay.
Except that I screwed up all the key figures, all the measures. But the data should load in, and a DSO is an object that is queryable by a Bex query. So theoretically, we should just be able to fire up Query Designer, which is its own piece of work, and create a Bex query based on it. So we're pretty much at that point right now, and that worked. It loaded up. Go to the Manage interface. We can see that there's data in there. We loaded in 38,000 records. DSOs, you need to activate the data. So DSOs and all info providers provide a sort of safety. They never display for reporting data that is in an inconsistent state. And the activation process makes the entire chunk of data that was loaded reportable all at the same instant. So it's kind of like using a database transaction, but it's not at the same. It's but it's managed in the ABAP layer instead of in the database layer. So it's.
Can you automate that commit or activation of the data, or is it something that has to be done manually?
What you do is BW has this concept called the process chain, which we can see over here on the left. And that's the process management aspect of BW, where you create a process chain that does everything from running the info package to load the data source, to running the DTP to load the DSO, to activating the data in the DSO, and when the process chain finishes, everything is ready for reporting.
Okay, so we've created all the individual steps, and the process chain just pulls that together and schedules that in our workflow. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So it's in the process of activating, and then when it's done, it'll be reportable, and we'll deal with that next time. We'll try to create a BEX query, and I'll fix my data model, and we'll see how it works. So I'll switch back to video now.
Great. So thanks very much, Ethan. That was very comprehensive. So what we can do next then is we can create this BEX query, and so in the next episode, and we'll fix up that data, and maybe if we just touch on that at the beginning of the next episode, so we
we'll go over that.
Show what we could do differently. Create the BEX query, and then we can actually just show the BusinessObjects tools working against that data.
Exactly.
So that, and then we can then start to get into the discussion about how we then turn this into an enterprise data warehouse. So
yeah, which is the really kind of interesting part of the deal, I think. So it'll be good to get there. But yeah, I mean, as you can see, it's BW is not pretty, and it's not particularly user friendly, I think. And I think that's really important to understand when you're getting into it, so that you don't get discouraged. It does, once you work around a lot of that stuff, it does help with a lot of things, but there's a big trade-off there, I think, and it's a discussion that we've been having in the community, I think, and I'm looking forward to learning more about that trade-off on both sides, I think. So.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for your time today.
Thanks for putting this together, Josh. I appreciate it.
Yeah, not a problem. So we'll release the next episode very soon. So stay tuned. Thanks very much, everyone.
All right.
Thanks, Ethan.
Good morning. Good night.
This podcast is hosted and sponsored by EV Technologies. Visit us on the net at savethecms.com. DSLayered!